In one unforgettable moment, the entire live audience went silent. No one saw it coming. The cameras were rolling, the lights were burning hot, and what began as a casual late-night exchange suddenly erupted into something far more explosive. Denzel Washington leaned back in his chair with that trademark smirk, tossing a jab meant to dismiss Karoline Leavitt as nothing more than a rookie with no place on the stage. The crowd laughed nervously, feeding off his confidence. But then, everything shifted. Karoline didn't flinch. She locked eyes with him, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Arrogance doesn't make you write it, only makes you louder." The words hung heavy in the air, sharper than anyone expected. Denzel tried to laugh it off, but the audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were leaning in, waiting, sensing that the energy in the room had flipped. The host shuffled his papers, desperate to regain control, but the moment had already escaped him. This wasn't a routine interview. It was a battle of truth versus ego, conviction versus performance. Karoline wasn't just defending herself. She was exposing the very arrogance that too often goes. It's unchallenged on America's biggest stages. The silence in the studio grew thick. It's almost electric, until a ripple of gasps spread through the crowd. One reply, one piercing moment of clarity. And suddenly the narrative had changed. But this was only the beginning of a confrontation that would ripple across America. The night had been advertised as must-see television long before the cameras even rolled. A top-rated late-night show, known for its star power and viral moments, had teased the pairing for weeks. Social feeds buzzed, hashtags trended, and millions tuned in live not for polite conversation, but for sparks. The producers knew what they were doing. Pit Hollywood's most respected icon against a rising political firebrand and watch the world react. For the audience in the studio and at home, this wasn't just entertainment. It was spectacle, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Because beneath the laughter and applause, something deeper was simmering. This was about more than two names. On a marquee, it was about identity, values, and the cultural clash defining America's moment. On one side stood Denzel Washington, a legend of the screen, carrying with him the aura of Hollywood elitism, the confidence that celebrity grants, the final word. On the other stood Karoline Leavitt, young, sharp, unflinching, representing the pushback against an establishment that mocked and dismissed voices like hers. The opening moments were drenched in tension. Denzel wasted no time playing to the crowd. With that seasoned timing honed over decades, he dropped a few lines that dripped with condescension. "She's got passion, I'll give her that." He smirked. But passion isn't wisdom. And wisdom? Well, that takes years she hasn't lived yet, the audience roared, clapping and laughing, feeding off his authority. But beneath the applause, the tension was building. Viewers across the country weren't just watching an actor spar with a politician, they were watching a test of conviction. Could youth and raw courage stand up to legacy and fame? Could truth stand against the intoxicating glow of Hollywood? The camera caught Karoline listening silently, her expression calm, her eyes unblinking. The audience didn't know it yet, but that composure was the calm before the storm. Every smirk, every patronizing laugh from Denzel was only tightening. The spring, the viewers could sense it, the room could feel it. Something was about to snap. And when Karoline finally spoke, everything changed. Denzel Washington. For decades, his very name has been synonymous with Hollywood greatness. From the gritty authenticity of Training Day to the inspirational weight of Remember the Titans, he carved a reputation as not only an actor, but a symbol someone who could embody integrity, resilience, and charisma on screen in a way few ever could. He was Hollywood royalty, admired across the political spectrum, celebrated for his artistry, and respected for his discipline. The industry painted him as untouchable, a figure whose very presence demanded deference. When Denzel entered a room, it was as if the lights shifted, the air grew heavier, and all eyes instinctively turned toward him. That aura carried into the live studio. The audience didn't just see a man, they saw a legacy. They cheered before he even spoke, laughed before the punchline landed, nodded along as though his every word carried the weight of scripture. Denzel wasn't just playing a role tonight, he was playing himself, and the crowd was ready to adore him. But beneath that polished image, cracks began to show. On stage, the wisdom and gravitas he was celebrated for seemed replaced by something colder. Arrogance seeped into his tone, a smugness that no amount of charm could hide. He didn't just disagree with Karoline, he dismissed her. When she spoke, he chuckled as if her words were amusingly naive. When she countered, he raised an eyebrow with the weariness of a king listening to a jester. Every gesture screamed dominance, a reminder that in his world, youth and defiance were not equals. They were irritants to be brushed aside. For a man who had built his career portraying dignity, it was striking how little he extended it to his opponent. He cut her off mid-sentence with theatrical ease, soaking in the applause as though the audience's laughter was proof of his superiority. He leaned back in his chair with that confident posture, arms folded, smile wide, exuding the energy of someone who believed the battle was already won before it began, and yet the contradictions could not be ignored. Here was a man long praised for his humility, now sneering with entitlement. Here was a figure celebrated for embodying justice on screen, now belittling someone daring to speak her truth. The audience began to notice too. Not everyone laughed. Some shifted uncomfortably. The cameras captured those subtle reactions, the furrowed brows, the pursed lips, the uneasy glances. For all his control of the stage, a question lingered in the air. Was this the real Denzel Washington? Tension tightened as he doubled down. With each patronizing remark, he framed himself not as a debater, but as a judge passing verdict. "You'll learn," he said at one point, smiling knowingly, "that fire without discipline burns you first." The words dripped with condescension, as if wisdom were his exclusive property, untouchable to anyone who hadn't spent decades basking in Hollywood spotlight. The studio audience roared again, but this time the laughter didn't mask the undercurrent, amplified it. This wasn't a debate, this was dominance. Dominance has a way of souring quickly, because arrogance, when exposed, becomes a divert, villain's undoing. And in those moments, Denzel wasn't just arguing. He was embodying everything his critics had whispered for years. That beneath the carefully cultivated persona lay a man intoxicated by his own status. Confident that his fame would silence opposition, the cameras didn't miss it, the viewers at home didn't miss it. You could see the dismissal, hear the smug tone, feel the weight of his entitlement. They were witnessing the mask slip, the myth of Hollywood dignity crumbling under the pressure of live television. Denzel was no longer the hero on screen. He was the antagonist in real life, and the stage lights that once glorified him now exposed every flaw. For Karoline, this wasn't just a conversation, it was a battlefield. She sat across from a man who had entire decades of admiration at his back. A studio crowd primed to side with him, and a cultural pedestal few could ever dream of reaching. On paper, it was an unfair feat a rookie stepping into the ring with a heavyweight champion, and that was precisely why the stakes felt so electric. The audience could sense it. The viewers could feel it. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. This was the collision of two Americas, one represented by the polished arrogance of Hollywood power, the other by the unpolished conviction of someone refusing to bow. And as Denzel smirked, certain of his triumph, no one in the room expected. What would come next? His dominance felt unshakable, his control absolute. But history has a way of surprising those who underestimate their challengers, because against him stood someone no one expected to fight back. Section 4. Karoline Leavitt's story does not begin on a stage under bright lights or in the presence of Hollywood cameras. It begins in the quiet grit of a small New England town, where long winters tested endurance and community was built on hard work, tradition, and an unshakable belief in earning one's way. She wasn't born into privilege, nor did she have the silver spoon of stardom to carry her forward. Her family's values were simple but profound: discipline, responsibility, faith, and a belief that no one owed you anything except the chance to prove yourself. From the start, Karoline was underestimated. Too young, too outspoken, too defiant. Of the rules that others said she must play by, Teachers dismissed her for being too bold in the classroom. Party insiders looked past her, assuming her ambition was just another youthful spark that would fade with time. But she refused to fade. Every dismissal became fuel. Every rejection hardened her resolve. Where others saw limits, she saw opportunity. Where others advised silence, she chose voice. Her path was not easy. She was told to wait her turn, to pay her dues, to accept that people like hers, small town, middle class, unconnected, were not meant to be players on the national stage. But Karoline was not interested in playing by those rules. She worked tirelessly, knocking on doors, speaking to voters' face, building a reputation not on headlines or glitz, but on authenticity. God. She was a fighter molded not by fame, but by friction, sharpened not by privilege, but by persistence. And persistence became her signature. When others stopped, she kept going. When others compromised, she stood firm. She understood the loneliness of being the only one in a room willing to say what needed to be said, and she carried that burden willingly. Her authenticity wasn't a strategy, it was her essence. She didn't polish her words for approval. She spoke them as they were. That rawness, that honesty, became her greatest strength. It wasn't long before people began to notice. Ordinary Americans saw themselves in her. The mother working 2 jobs, the farmer struggling to keep his land, the young graduate crushed under debt. They heard their own frustrations echoed in Karoline's words. She wasn't repeating prepackaged talking points from party elites. She was voicing the lived experiences of people who felt invisible. In her, they didn't just see a politician, they saw a representative of their struggle. That connection was emotional. It wasn't about left or right, Republican or Democrat. It was about truth and courage. When Karoline spoke, she carried the cadence of someone who had worked for everything, who had never been handed shortcuts, who knew the weight of being underestimated. She embodied the underdog spirit, the belief that even in the face of overwhelming odds, grit and clarity could carve a path forward in many ways. Her rise mirrored the struggle of millions of Americans watching at home. They knew the sting of being dismissed. They understood the grind of fighting for recognition in a world that seemed rigged against them. And when Karoline walked onto that stage opposite Denzel Washington, she carried not just her own story, but theirs. Her presence was not merely personal. It was symbolic. The courage it took to sit across from Hollywood royalty, to speak truth, without hesitation, was the same courage ordinary Americans longed to see in their leaders. She wasn't intimidated by celebrity or status. She wasn't softened by applause or swayed by arrogance. She brought the same small-town conviction to that stage that had carried her through years of struggle. That clarity, sharp, fearless, unyielding, was her weapon. And so, the stage was set not just for a debate, but for a clash of worlds. On one side stood the polished, entitled dominance of Hollywood power. On the other stood the raw authenticity of a young woman shaped by small-town grit and fueled by the spirit of millions who felt ignored. The contrast was electrifying. Viewers at home didn't need to be told who to root for. They felt it instinctively. They saw in Karoline's determination a piece of themselves, and in her defiance, their own voice rising. She was no longer just Karoline Leavitt. She was the embodiment of ordinary Americans who had waited too long to be heard. And when these two worlds collided on live television, sparks flew. Section 5. The debate began like any other, but the tension was unmistakable from the very first exchange. Denzel Washington leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had owned countless stages before. His smile was polished, his tone dripping with casual arrogance. He treated the debate less as a clash of ideas and more as a performance. It's a chance to showcase his wit at someone else's expense. When Karoline delivered her first point with clarity, Denzel chuckled audibly, shaking his head as if amused by her audacity. "Cute," he said with a smirk, earning a ripple of laughter from the audience. It wasn't a laugh of agreement, but of discomfort, the kind that fills the air when someone powerful ridicules an underdog. The audience wasn't sure whether to encourage him or brace for what was coming next. But Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or retaliate in kind. Instead, she straightened her posture, her voice calm and deliberate. Her composure in the face of mockery only magnified the contrast between them. Where Denzel leaned on smug theatrics, Karoline leaned on substance. Her every word was steady, her delivery unshaken. That only seemed to irritate Denzel more. The debate continued. He grew increasingly dismissive. He interrupted, waving his hand as if her points weren't worth his time. "You don't understand how the world works," he sneered, cutting her off mid-sentence. Some in the audience laughed again, but this time it was thinner, more hesitant. They could feel the imbalance in overconfident Titan leaning too heavily. On condescension, Karoline waited patiently through each interruption. When the moderator attempted to regain control, Denzel pushed louder, his voice raised, his dominance unmistakable. But while he grew louder, Karoline grew sharper. Her answers sliced through his theatrics, each one delivered with a firmness that left no room for dismissal. The rhythm of the clash intensified. Denzel's interruptions became more aggressive, his attempts to rattle her more blatant. Harder he pressed, the more unshaken she appeared. The audience began to shift. Their nervous laughter gave way to murmurs of admiration for Karoline's calm resolve. People leaned forward in their seats, sensing a storm brewing beneath the surface. At one point, Denzel mocked her youth, questioning whether someone like her had the experience to speak on serious matters. He smiled triumphantly, expecting another round of applause. Instead, the room fell oddly still. Karoline didn't rush to respond. She let the silence linger, her steady gaze fixed on him, the calm before a storm. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Voices had been raised, interruptions had piled up, and the audience was now on the edge of their seats. Everyone could feel that something monumental was about to happen. Denzel had pushed too far, and Karoline's poise was about to transform into something unforgettable. But then came the moment that silenced the entire room. Section 6. The air in the studio was heavy, charged with a tension that everyone could feel, but no one could cut except for Karoline. Denzel had just mocked her youth, leaning on his star power to cast her as inexperienced, unworthy, and out of her depth. For a moment, the audience chuckled nervously, unsure of whether to join in or recoil, and the laughter died down. The silence stretched. Karoline didn't blink. She sat with perfect composure, her hands folded lightly in front of her, her gaze locked onto Denzel with a piercing steadiness that unsettled even him. The camera zoomed in, catching the moment. A young woman staring down one of Hollywood's most celebrated figures without flinching. And then she spoke. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "You know, Mr. Washington," she began, each word carefully measured. "People like you have spent decades lecturing the rest of us about morality, responsibility, and truth. But the moment someone challenges you, you hide behind sarcasm and condescension." The audience gasped. No one expected her to go straight for the jugular. Denzel shifted in his seat, suddenly less comfortable. Smug grin faltered. Karoline leaned in slightly, her tone sharpening. "You mock me for being young. You mock me for being from a small town. But what you're really mocking?" She paused deliberately, letting the silence build. "Is every ordinary American watching right now who's tired of being sneered at by elites who think their fame gives them wisdom?" The room erupted in applause. Cheers, whistles, claps. Suddenly, the tide had turned. The very audience that had nervously laughed at Denzel's mockery was now roaring with support for Karoline. Denzel tried to interject, waving a hand dismissively. "That's not," he began, but Karoline didn't let him. She raised her hand, gently commanding the moment. "No, let me finish," she said firmly, her eyes never leaving his. The crowd cheered even louder. She continued, her words sharp as glass. "You tell us we don't understand how the world works. But maybe it's you who doesn't understand. Out here, in real America, people work 2 jobs just to pay bills. You wouldn't even notice. Mothers skip meals so their kids can eat. Families live paycheck to paycheck while Hollywood celebrities lecture them from multi-million-dollar mansions." The audience was on its feet now, some shouting in agreement. The camera caught faces in the crowd, wide-eyed mouths open, nodding furiously. Karoline leaned back slightly, her delivery cool and confident. So when you laugh at me, you're not laughing at me, you're laughing at them. Frankly, they've had enough. The cheers were deafening. The host struggled to calm the room, but it was impossible. Karoline had completely flipped the dynamic. Denzel sat frozen, his hands clasped, the smugness gone. He opened his mouth again, but Karoline struck once more. Her final blow precise and devastating. You claim to stand for truth, for justice, for the people. But when you sneer at someone who represents them, you reveal what you really stand for yourself. Silence. For a split second, the entire room went still. The weight of her words hung in the air like a hammer about to drop, and then the crowd exploded. Applause thundered through the studio. Some were on their feet, clapping and cheering as if they had witnessed a historic moment. The energy was electric, unstoppable, unforgettable. Denzel sat there, visibly shaken, his eyes darting as though searching for a way to recover. But there was none. Karoline's calm, surgical dismantling of his arrogance had left him with nothing to say. His legendary charisma, his dominance, his charm all useless in the face of her raw, undeniable truth. The camera zoomed in again. Karoline, serene, steady, unshaken. Denzel, speechless, humbled. The split-screen image told the whole story, the old guard brought down by a newcomer who refused to be silenced. The host, overwhelmed, finally stammered into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen. Wow. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a symbolic moment. A clash of Hollywood arrogance and small-town authenticity had played out in front of millions. And authenticity had won. The audience in the studio knew they had witnessed something that would ripple far beyond that night. The cheers lasted long after the exchange had ended, energy refusing to die down. Karoline had delivered the mic drop of the century. Denzel Washington, Hollywood. Royalty was left with nothing but silence. Section 7. Section 7. The aftermath. Shockwave's 600 words, the cameras faded to black. But the clash between Karoline and Denzel had only just begun to echo. Within minutes, clips from the live broadcast flooded social media. Twitter timelines lit up with disbelief. TikTok stitched her words into trending audios, and YouTube thumbnails blared headlines in bold red fonts. Karoline humiliates Denzel live. The moment had become digital wildfire. Hashtag shot in two. The stratosphere. Hashtag Karoline clap back. Hashtag Denzel exposed. Hashtag mic drop moment. Millions scrolled, commented, and shared. Each post amplifying the spectacle until it wasn't just a TV segment anymore, it was the conversation of the nation. Memes emerged overnight, capturing Denzel's stunned silence and pairing it with captions that turned into inside jokes across the internet. The audience's gasp became a cultural soundbite, replayed again and again. Commentators couldn't stay silent. Some hailed Karoline's poise, calling her performance the embodiment of grace under fire. Others, long critical of Hollywood elitism, declared at the moment America finally saw through the facade. Even critics who tried to defend Denzel couldn't ignore how lopsided the exchange had been. Political pundits broke down the encounter, frame by frame on cable news, each replay only strengthening the legend of the mic drop heard around the world. Network executives recognized the ratings gold they had stumbled into. The clip was replayed across late-night talk shows, morning news panels, and even international broadcasts. Viewers who had missed the live moment now felt compelled to catch up, desperate not to be left out of the frenzy. The more it replayed, the more the narrative hardened. Karoline had stood tall, where few dared, and Denzel had been reduced to silence. But what made the shockwave so powerful wasn't just the celebrity drama, it was what it represented. Two ordinary Americans watching. At home, it felt like a victory over arrogance, a reminder that authenticity could cut through even the most polished facade. For young immigrants, for small-town dreamers, for those who felt overlooked by cultural elites, Karoline's words carried a validation rarely seen on such a stage. She wasn't just debating, she was speaking for them. In coffee shops, classrooms, and office break rooms, people dissected the clash. Who was right? Who was wrong? What it meant for the broader culture. The debate itself became a mirror of America's divides. Hollywood defenders doubled down, but their rebuttals rang hollow against the virality of Karoline's performance. Each counter-argument only seemed to fuel the fire. As the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. This was more than a soundbite, it was a cultural reset. Karoline's name now carried weight far beyond political circles, and Denzel, despite his legendary status, was left to navigate an image suddenly dented by arrogance, exposed on national television. And while the noise swelled, one question lingered. In every viewer's mind, what deeper lesson could be learned from this storm of spectacle and truth? Section 8. Section 8. The resolution/moral lesson, 500 words, when the viral storm began to calm. Karoline stepped back from the noise, not to bask in glory, but to reframe what had really happened. For her, it wasn't about defeating a Hollywood giant or winning applause from millions online. It was about something deeper, the power of truth spoken with dignity, and the triumph of values over arrogance. She reminded audiences that respect is not won through dominance or fame, but through authenticity. Denzel's performance on stage had shown the dangers of elitism. How celebrity status can sometimes blind even the most admired figures to humility. Karoline, by contrast, embodied what ordinary people longed to see: courage without theatrics, conviction without cruelty, strength without arrogance. The lesson was clear. In a world obsessed with power, status, and ridicule, real authority comes from respect for truth, respect for others, and respect for oneself. Karoline's composure demonstrated that dignity could dismantle arrogance more effectively than anger ever could. Her clarity cut sharper than insults, and her restraint carried more weight than Denzel's dismissiveness. Viewers at home felt the shift. Many had tuned in expecting yet another celebrity-dominated exchange where charm and swagger carried the day. Instead, they witnessed something rare, a reminder that character still matters. Karoline's victory wasn't about politics or fame. It was about proving that courage can outshine celebrity power. Humility can silence even the loudest arrogance. As commentators debated the clash, many overlooked the emotional ripple it left with ordinary Americans. Parents told their children about the importance of speaking with respect, even when mocked. Students replayed the clip as proof that they too could stand up to authority without losing their composure. Everyday workers saw in Karoline a reflection of themselves, people underestimated, overlooked, yet capable of shaking even the most untouchable figures when armed with truth. The moral was universal. Ridicule may win a laugh, but respect wins the soul. Arrogance can dominate for a moment, but courage lasts for generations. And in the end, the strength to remain calm in the face of mockery is the greatest power of all. Karoline hadn't just won a debate, she had reminded a divided nation of something it had forgotten, that dignity is not weakness, and humility is not silence. In fact, they are the very qualities that elevate a person above noise, ego, and empty fame. Transition, and that's why this moment will be remembered for years to come. Section 9. Section 9. Outro and call to action, 300 words. And that brings us back to the headline moment. Karoline destroys Denzel Washington on live TV. What the world saw wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a turning point. One side stood arrogance, fueled by Hollywood prestige. On the other stood dignity, courage, and unshakable truth. And in that unforgettable moment, the latter prevailed. This story isn't about celebrity takedowns for entertainment. It's about something bigger, the reminder that values still matter, that respect always outlasts ridicule, and that even in the loudest arenas, authenticity carries the greatest power. Karoline's triumph wasn't just hers alone. It was a victory for everyone who has ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. Now, the question is, where do we go from here? If you believe in standing for truth, if you believe in dignity over arrogance, then this is your movement too. By being here, you're already part of something larger, a community that refuses to bow to elitism and instead uplifts courage, clarity, and respect. Subscribe now to stay with us on this journey. Share this video with friends and family. Let them see the moment dignity crushed arrogance. Drop a comment below. What did this debate mean to you?